So what do you make of Canada's tariffs, or the US tariffs on Canada, and Canada's retaliatory tariffs as well? What do you make of this?
Delighted to join you today. I think it's a very complicated issue because the two countries are joined at the hip geographically, and especially, I was going to say they can't survive without each other. One of the two cannot survive without the other. So, and that's Canada. So clearly, in that sort of tit for tat trade war, one player in that game is weaker than the other, but it doesn't prevent them from entering that sort of escalating war of words and burgeoning trade war. What was interesting, symbolically yesterday there was a G7 meeting of foreign ministers of G7 member states in the charming Québécois village of Charlevoix. And during that 24 hours sort of meeting, they used, diplomatic language, but they couldn't hide the tensions, right? And on the face of it, superficially, America seemed isolated, apart perhaps from Italy, but, putting aside Italy, 5 of the 6 G7 nations seemed to side with Canada. The Brits did that very politely and softly. So four of the 7 G7 nations, led by France, seemed to side squarely with Canada. The Italians and the Brits, politely neutral, and America alone, superb isolation. On the other hand, that's fairly superficial, I think, perspective, but that's something that was visible for us to see yesterday. More seriously, why is it not a balanced relationship? For a simple reason, is that Canada, so the Canadian economy, needs to do business with America much more than the other way around, right?
Well, that's true, of course, and Quebec's aluminium industry is particularly hurting right now. But these tariffs could destabilize the entire region, couldn't they? And American consumers are going to feel the pain of this too, right?
Yes, indeed. You are absolutely right. So I think, what we call in economics game theory, right, is a fancy word, which means that we have mathematical sort of geometric models to visualize and plan the outcome of these games, or games of chicken, more colloquially. But to be honest, no one knows the future, because no one knows the outcome, because there are so many moving variables, moving targets happening at the same time. So that's the problem. So of course, if it becomes an all-out trade war, which is one possibility, so one avenue would be the all-out trade war, which was, hinted at not for long. Doug Ford, who's the prime minister of the one of the two, because the Canadian economy itself is based on 2 provinces. So 2 states account for 90% of the GDP. So it's about Quebec and Ontario, and the rest doesn't matter much. So the Prime Minister of Ontario is very powerful, and he tried the tough road 5 days ago with Trump, and he only lasted 24 hours. And what is the tough road? Is to tell to the Americans, you're very blunt with us. We are going to be brutal with you as a consequence. And Doug Ford said, okay, from now on, all the power, all the energy flowing from Ontario into American factories will be slapped an export tax. The White House was shocked and very angered. And the reaction of the White House was so brutal that poor Doug Ford had to backpedal 4 days ago. So he lasted 1 day in that avenue, which is one of the avenues open to Canada in the future, which is the all-out trade war. But that would be suicidal. Look what happened, to Doug Ford 5 days ago. So what I'm coming at is they will slap on each other in a ballet, in a choreographed ballet, incremental taxes to hurt each other quote unquote, but it will be done within limit. So part of it, I think, will be theatrics. Of course, part of it will be real. And the hope is after 1-2 months of that game, they will reach a settlement. It's one avenue. So the rational outcome would be for Canada, to be honest, to make a few concessions. But so far, the Canadians and the Europeans don't want to go that route. So this is the route that the White House would like them to take in the next 1 or 2 months after being pressured. They don't want.
Well, one of the concessions that Donald Trump is really after is for Canada to become the 51st U.S. state. Now, it sounded like a joke at first, but people close to Donald Trump around him in the White House say he's obsessed with this and he's serious about it. The new Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, has said this is obviously never going to happen. But what do you make of this rhetoric about trying to take over the neighboring country and make it a part of the United States?
Well, you said the word, excuse my Greek. It is a rhetorical game. And the problem is, once again, to be fair, Trump can be brutal, abrasive. He can look disorganized. I think he's not, but the Trump White House can be perceived as being, quite disorganized and clumsy at times, and a bit brutal verbally, rhetorically. And so people, in Europe and Canada can be, faint-hearted, right? So they can be very sensitive, and they tend to overreact to Trump's theatrics, if you will. But to make a long story short, there's a logic to the madness. So there's something behind that brutal theatrical rhetorics. What does it mean? For Trump and for a new generation of American policy planners, to be honest and brutal, Europe, Britain, Canada are all irrelevant. Why are they sadly irrelevant to them? Because they are fiercely, extremely focused on new great game. So the new great game being, to make a long story short, the accelerating techno-industrial rivalry with China. And it's very focused on just three or four sectors or 3 or 4 issues, and high tech, deep tech, AI, and energy, of course, and the massive transportation infrastructure assets of the future. And these gigantic transport infra assets of the future, they will have to go through Canada, the North Pole, and Greenland. So it's one of the reasons why people make fun of Trump, say, oh, he's an imbecile, the Greenland and the North Pole. No, he's not an imbecile. In that rivalry with China, these gigantic, soon to be opened Arctic, trade routes will be crucial because transport infrastructure, the canals, same logic for the Panama Canal. Gigantic transport infrastructure cannot be in the hand of China. So these guys are brutal, yes, perhaps, but they're very focused on the 5th industrial revolution, which is another word for the techno-industrial race with China. And they came to the conclusion that Europe, Canada, Britain, it hurts our feelings, but are, quote unquote, to them, irrelevant. And it also explains why they are now changing tack on Russia.
Okay. Okay, well, let's just, because Canada now, of course, exploring new trading partners, including in Europe and Asia. Of course, Europe is doing pretty much the same. Isn't the result of this going to be that the United States, people will start turning away from the United States, and might actually, people across the world, countries across the world, might actually start turning towards China rather than towards the United States?
You're making an excellent point. I'm going to just divide your question in 2 parts. In geofinance or geoeconomics, the most important term is geo. Geo is much more important, geography, than finance and economics. And in Canada and Europe, they tend to forget that, to their great chagrin. Why? Because the Canadian economy was started as a British imperial economic project, and it was always built on a north-south axis. What does it mean? So Quebec's economy was right from the start, Montreal, Quebec, structured to do business with New Hampshire, Vermont, and upstate New York. Ontario's economy, right from the start, was completely structured to do business with Michigan and Illinois across the lakes. The Canadian made a mistake, being stingy, being very stingy and not very well at economic planning, unlike the Chinese, for example.
Okay, well, I'm sorry to cut you short, but we are just out of time. But I think we got the general idea. Thank you so much for joining us here on Q News. Maher Nicolas Firzli, who is a regular guest here, and always a pleasure to have you on.